in which I play Crack the Whip with the train, or, if you prefer, the Raspberry Tenors. Dear guests, my gosh, there's a lot of you crammed in here today. I don't know if any of you have heard the story about how I split myself in two and whooped it up in town and village at one and the same time. Eh? You think you have? But you, ma'am, say you haven't? Anyway, no matter. Splitting in two, that's nothing. One time I split into an entire work gang. It happened like this. I was on a train with my Uncle Vanya, heading home after having been down to the big city of Moscow. My uncle had some personal affairs that needed taking care of there, and he'd also wanted to visit a couple of haberdasheries. When he asked me to accompany him on his trip, I said sure. But a week in that place was 6 days too many. Now I was in a hurry to get back to Mrs. Malina and her home cooking, and to my buddies too, so I could regale them with shocking but true tales about the 1,000,000+ Muscovites milling around in that megalopolis of theirs. And to my mind, our transportation was moving way too slow. Well, if you don't like something, you've got two choices. A, you live with it, or B, you change it. I hopped off the train and began jogging along beside it. Then, grabbing hold of the door handle of a freight wagon, I started pushing in a forward direction. The train's big steel wheels got the hint and replaced their cluckety-cluck with clackety-clack. It was midwinter and the temperature was down in the triple digits. Despite the cold, my exertions quickly had me sweating, especially since I was wearing a hareskin coat. So, leaving off pushing for a moment, I scooted forward till I was alongside the compartment I was sharing with my uncle. When Uncle Vanya interrupted the filing of his nails in order to take a sip from a silver flask, I caught his eye, whereupon he promptly lowered the window. I pulled my coat off and tossed this up to him, then got back to huffing and puffing. Shortly afterwards, we began descending a very long and very steep grade. With gravity added to the impetuses, the locomotive accelerated. Suddenly, I was no longer pushing, but instead running to keep up, while still clutching the door handle. Down, down hurtled the train, faster and faster, clickety-click, clickety-click, clickety-click. Now I was racing flat out, praying that I wouldn't stumble. The engine whistle gave a piercing shriek. As the sound faded, and traveling at what must have been close to 100 versts an hour, our train entered a curve. The wagon whose handle I had my hand wrapped around was only 3 cars up from the caboose. When this wagon's turn came to round the curve, I was jerked off my feet with such force my arm was almost ripped from its socket. I could have simply allowed myself to be thrown clear into the frozen swamp or the furry woods. In retrospect, that would have been a lot less traumatic. But yours truly just had to hang on to that stupid handle, didn't he? So there I was, being pulled through the air by a train going at breakneck speed. Unfortunately, because of the extreme temperature compounded by a major wind chill, and because I was soaked in sweat and coatless, my body quickly froze and turned brittle. Fortunately, because I was totally benumbed, I didn't experience any pain. We have a footnote here. Keep reading. When parts of me began breaking off. I lost my left foot when it struck a verststone. When the wagon rocked suddenly from side to side, causing me to slam against it, I parted company with my right arm. Bam! Something I didn't see took my right leg from the knee down. Next, the train went around another, this time tighter, curve, and I smashed into a signal post with my hip. Eventually, all that was left of me was one arm, one shoulder, and my head. With my hand clinging to the handle, my elbow tapping against the side of the wagon, The train had now slowed to its normal speed, and my face, white from frostbite, looking down at the ground just inches away. Sensing the futility of it all, I at last released my grip and let myself drop. My final muddled thought was, at least I won't be around for the wife's crying and histrionics when Uncle Vanya gives her the news. Then the last of my brains froze, and I knew no more. Spring was even later than usual coming to Pomorye that year. It wasn't until early April that the temperature rose above zero for the first time, for all of an hour. A couple of days later it did so again, and this time it stayed above freezing for the rest of the day. Water dripped from the tree branches. Birds chirped. Over the week that followed, starting in the south, the snow melted, exposing my body parts strewn along the railway tracks. As if to make up for the lack of it earlier, our first sensation was one of intense pain. That pain you feel when you thaw out your frozen fingers by the stove, only multiplied 1,000-fold. If my digits and limbs and torso had been capable of screaming, they would have. I'm not ashamed to tell you that my mouth screamed at the top of screamed for all it was worth. Plus, the pain was recurring. Every night we would refreeze to suffer the agony of thawing all over again the next day. You can imagine how desperately we waited for each sunset and how deeply we dreaded daybreak. When the freeze-thaw torture finally ended, some new pains began. These pains, though, thankfully, were a kind we could live with. They were a tiny price to pay for the miracle that was now happening. For so powerful was the Malina lust for life that, like a salamander growing a new tail to replace the one lost to the crow, the missing sections of my body were growing back. A shin poked out of my left Valanki boot, to then add a knee, followed by a thigh. A matching leg formed. Waist, chest, and spine developed, then arms and hands and fingers, and finally a head, complete with accessories. Farther along the tracks, my right elbow extended in opposing directions to make an arm. A shoulder materialized, and so on. Still farther up, a hip initiated the regeneration process by growing a twin. Each of my broken-off body parts developed into a separate, fully functional Senya Malina. One by one, we new Malinas stood up from the cinders, brushed ourselves off, stamped our feet and swung our arms to get the blood flowing, looked around, and began hiking north. First just me, then a pair of us, soon a half-dozen, finally a company. And as our numbers swelled, so did the sound of our exuberant singing. When folks in Weema saw us approaching, they figured we were either a chorus of carpenters coming to build new houses, or jolly clay kneaders en route to Archangel to work in its foundry. But when we got closer, people gasped in glad amazement. "Hey, look! It's Senya! He's alive! Hey, everybody, Senya's come back from the dead!" But, wait a minute. What's going on? You can't all be Senya. Yet every one of you's got his height and his color, his beard bush, eye twinkle, and gut jut. Who's the real Senya? How's Mrs. Malina going to know her old man now? In no time, a wondering mob was swarming around us. But if we were an odd sight for them, my fellow villagers were an odd sight for us, because every last one of them was dressed in mourning clothes. They asked Uncle Vanya, the last person to see me alive and in singular form, which of us was the real me. My uncle, wearing an elegant suit of black velvet, affixed his pince-nez, looked us over carefully, then confessed, "Darned if I know." My wife rushed up and pushed through the crowd. She was beaming from ear to ear, and her eyes were all a-glitter. She cried, "Whichever one has the strongest back and willingest hands, that'll be my man. My Senya is an exemplary worker." I decided for once to rise to the wife's challenge, to show her what I was really capable of, and I put ourselves to work. I repaired the hayloft, planted the garden, sowed the field, reshod Karka, fashioned reins, fed the ducks, dug a new outhouse pit, painted the roof, fixed the cart, gathered firewood and split it, stoked the banya, constructed a bench, pounded flour, swept the floors, sewed new hems on the wife's skirts, and patched again that pesky leak in the rowboat. You know what they say about many hands and light work. Although the homeowner in Mrs. Malina was certainly satisfied, her burning curiosity was not. Like everybody else in the village, my wife was convinced that there was one genuine me and that the rest of us were a bunch of clones, and she'd figured a study of our work habits would reveal this real Malina. But there was no shirker among us. In fact, we'd all worked equally hard. She tried a different tactic. Turning coy, feigning surprise herself, one after the other she surprised each of us alone, in the loft, back in the woods, behind the front door, in the banya, under the boat, etc., etc. But, to her private delight, my wife discovered that we were all the best kissers. Mrs. Malina had one last card she could play, and it was a good one. She disappeared into the kitchen. After what seemed an eternity, her voice rang out, "Malina, husband, come get it while it's hot." Like a bullet, I shot towards the dinner table. So did 16 others. And somehow in the process of all trying to sit down in the same chair, me and all the other yours trulies merged back into one. Well, that spring was easily the hardest spring I've ever experienced. The rest of the year was the most sweetly lazy stretch of time of many sweet, lazy times in my life. During my absence, Roska had given birth to a litter of piebald puppies, and many a happy hour was whiled away playing with those little rascals. I also did a lot of fishing and tramping in the woods, and of course I never turned down anyone's request for the telling of a truly tall tale. Kind guests, if there are any doubting Thomases among you who decline to believe this story, I'd ask you to pay close attention to the vegetation bordering the railway tracks the next time you travel south. You'll see raspberry bushes growing up in a thick, uninterrupted stretch between Weema and Verst 717. What solider proof could there be than this? Here's another footnote, a final one, this one from Blackwell Boyce. Senya clearly was not aware of the following fact. However, the coincidence is so remarkable and so relevant to his tale that it cannot not be mentioned. In addition to being able to regenerate appendages, the Siberian salamander, the very species native to Pomorye, possesses a second unique ability. As a cold-blooded creature adapted to an extreme climate, it can be frozen solid without suffering any adverse effect. Upon thawing, several months or even years later, it will simply resume its crawling, picking up where it left off.